You ever hear someone make an argument assembling all the right premises? It's easy to follow, you can see the natural conclusion coming, only they suddenly U-turn to the opposite conclusion and then, even more confusingly, act like it somehow obviously makes sense. If I told you that A leads to B and B leads to C, for example, your brain is probably prompted to think what? Well, A must lead to C, of course, but I say no. A and C are completely unrelated concepts, actually, and then I mock you with jokes that don't really land because they're built upon the delusion that I just established. Something like that is the Jon Stewart bit. Take basic premises to an illogical conclusion and then laugh at you if you don't follow the confusion, in this case, about guns. Jon Stewart making the argument that guns only protect the rights of the people who have the guns, and therefore only the government should have guns. If that doesn't make any sense, well, he'll try to make it sensible momentarily. But first, the context. On Jon Stewart's Daily Show Monday, he was mocking Elon Musk's appearance at Donald Trump's Butler, Pennsylvania campaign rally last weekend. And fair enough, Elon Musk as hype man is clearly not his natural role, so mock away. But it wasn't the presentation that Jon Stewart was ripping, at least primarily. It was the premise. Elon Musk spoke briefly about why a Donald Trump victory is so important to him. He said that your speech rights and the integrity of the First Amendment depend on it.
The other side wants to take away your freedom of speech. You must have free speech in order to have democracy. That's why it's the First Amendment.
Oh, but it's Elon Musk who's clearly out of touch. Obviously, Trump is the true danger to free speech principles.
Elon, were you not watching the rest of the show? A movie Trump doesn't like is going to get sued. A tech mogul he doesn't like, he wants to put in prison. It's not free speech if only Trump's admirers get to do it without consequence.
Yes, Trump is the free speech threat because he wrote in a book that if Mark Zuckerberg does anything illegal, not says or writes the wrong thing, but does anything illegal, he should go to prison. A comment explicitly about action, not speech, and a premise with which Jon Stewart agrees, actually. Well, what do you mean, Donald? That's why Zuck should go to jail?
That's why he'll be in prison? Not for falsely promising me a beautiful life in the metaverse?
And yeah, it's a joke, I get it, but the premise of the bit is that Zuck is a bad guy who needs accountability. But also Trump is a bad guy if he wants that accountability. The other reason Trump is a big free speech danger is because he threatened a defamation lawsuit against the people who made a movie depicting him as a rapist and a crook.
The Donald Trump biopic, The Apprentice, does not always portray Donald Trump in a flattering light, and the Trump campaign threatened to sue its filmmakers.
Even if it happened, that would be private action in defense of an individual's reputation, not government censorship of a particular disfavored opinion. But that's not even my point. Again, Jon Stewart grants that point, actually. Well, sure, the argument is valid, but we'll just clown nose that point away. So here's an unrelated laugh line, and we'll just move on.
Calling the film pure fiction and election interference.
Oh, come on! That's election interference? It's not, maybe it's election interference, but you got to be a little bit flattered that you're being played by Sebastian Stan.
But even if you do think Trump has been hostile to free speech principles with these comments, fine. But the question is, compared to what? Who has Trump actually censored? Who has Trump put in prison for speech crimes? Trump says a lot of stuff, sure, but what anti-speech stuff has he actually done? Because those questions applied to the incumbent are much worse, actually. If we're worried about imprisoning people for speech, ask Douglas Mackey, who the Biden DOJ is currently trying to lock up for memeing too hard in 2016. Ask Mark Houck, who was prosecuted by Biden's DOJ after an FBI raid on his home for the supposed crime of protesting at a Planned Parenthood. More specifically, an accusation of a shove when he was confronted, but why would that be a matter for federal law enforcement at all? Well, it was because of the pro-life, anti-abortion perspective involved. It was because it happened at an abortion facility. That's all. And if you think Houck did anything wrong, ask why he was acquitted at trial. Ask why Merrick Garland and company are still prosecuting their political rival for speech crimes prior to January 6th, despite a Supreme Court decision undoing much of the substance of their case. Ask why the White House had direct communication portals with the social media companies to coordinate the censorship of Americans during COVID. Americans who were right about the virus origins and masks and the injectable and lockdowns and all the other nonsense that saved nobody and damaged millions. And yes, that lawsuit was dismissed by the Supreme Court, but not on the merits. It was on standing technicality. The factual assessment remains. The point is, throw a dart at Biden's DOJ, and it's going to hit some guy sitting in a cubicle working every day on diminishing the First Amendment and facing no accountability for it. But somehow, if we're worried about free speech, we're supposed to watch out for the guy out of power with a 4-year track record of punishing nobody for wrongthink over the guy currently in power with a full term of censorship behind him on a scale never before seen in the history of this country, according to a federal judge. Okay, so what's the part of Jon Stewart's argument that actually makes any sense, you may be wondering? Well, I haven't made it there yet. All of that is just the wind-up for the big whiff of a swing that's celebrated as though it's a home run. Stewart moves on to Musk's next premise that Democrats likewise threaten the Second Amendment, and the second protects the first.
But at least the Constitution remains intact and is there to ensure that we have the First Amendment.
The Second Amendment is there to ensure that we have the First Amendment.
Why is that a laugh line? I guess to these people, it's a laugh line because it's not working out that way in practice. Oh, ha, 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 you guys have all the guns, but we still censor you anyway. Yeah, we probably are a country that's lacking some courage in that respect. I'll give you that. But the point, of course, is the principle. An armed citizenry can, in principle, defend its rights if it has the courage to do so. What exactly is wrong or funny about that premise?
Guns don't protect our free speech. Our free speech is protected by the consent of the governed laid out through the Constitution. It's not based on the threat of violence. It's based on elections.
Well, consent of the governed and the vote are often opposing forces to the rights of the individual, though. People consenting against you does not protect your rights. People voting against you does not protect your rights. If they hate you and outnumber you, only force can defend you, actually. How exactly does a minority vote itself out of oppression? By numerical definition, it can't. They don't have the numbers. That's what makes them a minority. So yes, it is preferable for all of society to respect minority rights all the way down to the smallest minority, the individual, but what happens when they don't? What happens when 2 wolves and a sheep vote for what's for dinner? John's answer is apparently just vote, sheep, because your rights are only what the powerful think of them. And then we finally get to the point that makes that glimmer of sense. Jon says, actually, guns only protect the speech of the people who have the guns.
Guns, from what I can tell, seem to mostly protect the speech of the people holding the gun.
Right. Someone post the Yes Chad meme, because yes, that was literally Elon's point. If you have a gun, then your rights, including your speech rights, are better protected than if you had no gun. Just a minute ago, Jon said guns do not protect speech. Now he says guns do protect speech, actually, as long as you are holding the gun. And somehow this is a laugh line, not a fatal contradiction. Well, whatever. When you say this is about protecting yourself, actually, it's about coercion. It's about intimidation, not liberation.
It's a tool of intimidation. It is a tool of intimidation, and one that I think is actually being irresponsibly and recklessly invoked.
Yes, guns intimidate. Again, that's the point. The question is, who should be intimidated? The government or the people? If your premise is that guns intimidate, how is your conclusion that only the government should have that intimidation power? Well, it's far better for the government to intimidate me than for my neighbors to intimidate me, is it? Why?
I would prefer at this moment not to trade in a government that offers me many remedies for my concerns, legitimate or illegitimate, for a situation where my rights are determined by how many militia members agree with me.
So militia members, otherwise known as your neighbors having guns, is a threat to your rights inherently. But the government having those same guns is not. How? If guns are just an intimidation tool, inherently coercive, then how are they threatening and bad when held by people, but protective and good when held by the state? Because if rights do go where the guns go, well, one, that undoes all the prior argument that guns don't protect rights, but two, why should the guns and the rights that go with them go to the government and not to the people? Why is government control of your neighbors preferable to your neighbor's control of government? Does power justly flow from the people to the government or from government onto the people? To that point, Jon is correct. This is a question of where our rights come from. It's just he botches the answer badly. By his reasoning, our rights come from the government. They exist only if the vote affirms them, and only as long as the government gun doesn't get pointed against them. Oh, well, I want a society where that never happens, where the government gun never gets unjustly pointed at all. Yeah, great. And I want a world where I can eat pizza and cake every meal and not get fat, but that is not reality. That is not the natural order. Society is, in fact, an artificial creation. Just like the gun, society itself is just a tool. And it only functions as Jon and the rest of us want it to, so long as good and moral people uphold it. But if they don't, society gets corrupted and the world falls back to its natural state, anarchy and chaos. And in that natural state, as in without any government at all, where do rights or right and wrong come from? Do right and wrong cease to exist? There is no right or wrong until a vote is held to determine them, or do right and wrong already exist, and it's just a question of whether government properly recognizes them or not? If right and wrong are pre-existing concepts, and government is merely a tool to advance them, then we must have an answer for what happens when government betrays that purpose, when government destroys right and wrong instead of protecting them. And that answer is self-defense. It is force. It is, yes, the gun. Because when wrong is enforced at gunpoint, the only correction is at gunpoint. There is no argument, there is no debate, there is no vote that will stop that trigger pull. The only possible response to unjust force is just force. And if you flip that entire premise that right and wrong are pre-existing God-given concepts and that power rightfully belongs to the people to uphold and enforce them, well, then you have no business lecturing the rest of us as backward, because you're the one taking our founding philosophy all the way through the funhouse and out back to the woodshed, not us. And worst of all, you didn't even finish the argument. You never even explained the more plausible, obvious alternative. If Elon is so wrong that the Second Amendment protects the First and all the others, then why is the Second Amendment listed where it is? In fact, why is the Second even listed at all? Were the Founding Fathers just a bunch of ancient gun fetishists? They actually had no connection to moral truth. They just really liked big sticks that go boom, because you seem to be a really big fan of everything else that they said, so why not that part? For what purpose was the Second Amendment instituted? And if it was just a big error, then what is the more plausible alternative to it? And if the alternative is that it has no purpose and it shouldn't be instituted, just surrender to government because government is an automatically moral actor, well, fair enough. Thank you for your honesty and Godspeed. Just please spare us the supposedly anti-authoritarian mockery, because that argument is a blank check for the authoritarian. So long as he holds the gun, and lucky for him, he always holds the gun, because the authoritarian never disarms. The only question is just whether you are foolish enough to. Thanks as always for listening and for supporting this channel. Always appreciate that thoughtful discussion down below, and especially over on X, that is at ML Christiansen. You're always welcome to coming out and chatting my live streams. Those are live on Wednesday and Sunday nights. Looking forward to it. Goodbye.